the HOA president, stood at the curb screaming into her phone that an armed trespasser was destroying community property in my driveway. I was wearing an old army t-shirt, gym shorts, and one rubber glove, lying beneath my son's pickup with 5 quarts of motor oil beside my head. 9 minutes later, 2 military police officers stepped out of their cruiser, took one look at me, and snapped to attention so fast the woman nearly dropped her clipboard. My name is Marcus Hale, and at the time this happened, I was the newly appointed garrison commander of Fort Redstone, an army installation outside Colorado Springs that supported nearly 40,000 soldiers, civilian employees, contractors, and family members. I'd been in command for 27 days, which was apparently not enough time for Vivian Crow, president of the Cedar Ridge Heights Homeowners Association, to learn the name of the man living 3 doors down from her. To be fair, I had not introduced myself with the parade. I had not hung my rank on the mailbox or parked a staff car outside the house. I had spent enough years around people impressed by titles to know that the quickest way to learn someone's character is to let them believe you have none. Vivian believed that was just another tired military father who would pay whatever fine she printed, apologize for whatever offense she invented, and disappear behind a closed garage door. That assumption became the most expensive mistake of her life. My wife Rebecca and I had moved into Cedar Ridge Heights in late April with our 20-year-old son Owen, who was home from college for the summer, and our aging black Labrador, Scout, whose main contribution to national defense was barking at delivery trucks and then hiding behind the couch. The neighborhood sat along a ridge east of the mountains, close enough to Fort Redstone that you could hear morning artillery when the wind shifted, but far enough away that the houses had wide yards, stone fireplaces, and Sunset View's real estate agents described with words like breathtaking and exclusive. About half the residents were military families. The rest were retired officers, defense contractors, and civilians who liked living near the base without having to salute anyone. Rebecca fell in love with the kitchen. Owen fell in love with the 3-car garage. I fell in love with the quiet. After 3 combat deployments and more moves than I cared to count, quiet felt like a luxury no housing allowance could measure. Vivian Crow introduced herself through a letter 8 days after we arrived. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and stamped with a silver cedar tree. The first paragraph welcomed us warmly. The next 4 listed our failures. Rebecca's SUV still had Virginia plates. Owen's 16-year-old Chevrolet Silverado had paint fading above the rear wheel. Our garage door had remained open for 43 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon. A stack of flattened moving boxes had been visible from the street. The letter ended with a reminder that Cedar Ridge Heights was a community of distinction, and that every homeowner shared responsibility for preserving property values. Rebecca read it at the kitchen island, looked across at me, and said, "Did she time the garage door?" 43 minutes, I said. That takes commitment. Rebecca did not laugh. She taught high school government for 22 years and had a natural distrust of anyone who used decorative stationery to threaten people. I told her to put the letter in a plastic sleeve. She knew what that meant. I'd kept binders since a landlord near Fort Bragg tried to charge us for carpet damage in a room that never had carpet. Every house, every lease, every inspection, every complaint, every receipt. People called it excessive until something went wrong. Then suddenly, I was the only man in the room who knew the exact date, time, and wording of every conversation. 11 days later, the first fines arrived. $300 for the Virginia plate, $450 for the faded paint on Owen's truck, $200 for the open garage. The total was $950, payable within 10 days, with daily penalties after that. Owen stood in the driveway that evening, staring at his truck like it had betrayed him. He had bought it with money from 2 summers working at a tire shop, and the faded patch was no bigger than a dinner plate. The engine ran clean. The brakes were new. He had rebuilt the front suspension himself. "Are they really allowed to fine me because the paint is ugly?" he asked. "They can print anything they want," I told him. "That doesn't mean they can enforce it." I placed the notice behind tab 2 of the binder and wrote unpaid across a copy. I did not call Vivian. I did not attend the next board meeting. I did not send an angry email that could be quoted later without context. I waited, because people who enjoy authority more than responsibility always escalate when silence denies them the reaction they want. While I waited, I made one quiet call from my office to Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Cole, the provost marshal responsible for military police operations at Fort Redstone. I asked how many dispatch requests had come from Cedar Ridge Heights during the previous year. He paused before answering, then said, "Sir, are you asking because of Vivian Crow?" "I'm asking for the numbers." He exhaled through his nose. "Give me until Monday." The report arrived in a sealed folder at 6:30 Monday morning. Cedar Ridge Heights had contacted military police dispatch 312 times in 12 months. 261 calls came from Vivian's phone. Not one resulted in an arrest, citation, or confirmed threat. She had reported soldiers for parking work trucks outside their homes, children playing basketball after 7, dogs barking, motorcycles starting before sunrise, flags mounted at improper angles, and one staff sergeant who had grilled steaks on a weeknight. Nearly every person she reported was enlisted. Most were young families living paycheck to paycheck. The exact people least likely to spend thousands fighting a $400 fine. I sat alone in my office reading their names, ranks, and addresses, and I felt something colder than anger settle into place. Vivian was not protecting property values. She had discovered that military families were easy to intimidate because they moved often, followed rules, and worried that civilian trouble might reach their chain of command. She had turned those fears into a business model. I wrote one sentence in the margin of the report: "Find the pattern." The next Saturday, I was under Owen's truck, draining the oil when Vivian's white Mercedes stopped at the curb. She stepped out wearing a pale blue blazer, oversized sunglasses, and the expression of a woman arriving to inspect damage after a natural disaster. 3 HOA board members followed in another vehicle and spread out along the sidewalk with their phones raised. Vivian walked to the edge of my driveway and called out, "I need the homeowner to come speak with me immediately." I slid out from beneath the truck, stood and wiped my hands on a rag. "You found him." She lifted her clipboard. "Your fines are now delinquent. Your son's vehicle remains non-compliant, and you are performing prohibited mechanical work in view of the street. This driveway is now under enforcement review." I glanced at the truck, then at the concrete beneath my feet. "This is private property. It is property governed by the association. Those are not the same thing." Her mouth tightened. "You military people always arrive believing federal employment makes you exempt from community standards." That sentence told me more than every letter she had sent. This was not about paint, plates, or an open garage. Vivian resented the family she had learned to control, and she enjoyed reminding them that outside the gate their uniforms meant nothing. I told her to leave my property and direct all future communication to council. She laughed, pulled out her phone, and announced that she would have my son's truck removed before sundown. Then she called military police and reported an aggressive stranger dismantling a suspicious vehicle in a residential driveway. When the patrol arrived, Sergeant Luis Mendoza stepped out first. I had presented him with an award 2 weeks earlier after he talked an armed soldier through a mental health crisis without firing a shot. He saw me, stopped, and saluted. His partner did the same. Vivian lowered her phone. Sergeant Mendoza turned toward her and said, "Very carefully, ma'am. This is Colonel Marcus Hale, commanding officer of Fort Redstone Garrison. My entire chain of command reports through him." For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then Vivian pushed her sunglasses higher on her nose and said, "Good. Then I finally know who to report him to." That was the moment I understood she would not retreat, no matter what the truth cost her. I returned Mendoza's salute, looked past Vivian at the 3 phones recording everything, and made a decision I had learned in places far more dangerous than a Colorado cul-de-sac. I would not stop her from escalating. I would document every step and let her lead me to whatever she was so desperate to protect. Vivian started the following Monday with 3 complaints, each one sent to a different office because she apparently believed government buildings worked like vending machines. And if one button failed to produce the results she wanted, she only needed to press another. The first complaint landed in my headquarters, addressed to Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hale, which told me she had researched just enough to be confident and not enough to be accurate. She demanded that the installation discipline a junior officer for using his position to intimidate a civilian board president. My executive officer, Major Claire Donovan, carried the envelope into my office with 2 fingers and said, "Sir, should I tell her you've been promoted?" I told Claire to stamp it received, make a certified copy, and send the original to legal. The second complaint went to the Inspector General, accusing me of ordering military police to humiliate her in public. The investigator called me the next morning, listened to the patrol audio, watched the body camera footage, and closed the complaint before lunch. The third was more serious because Vivian hired an attorney in Denver and filed a formal demand for payment against our home. By then, the HOA claimed we owed $3,800 in fines, late fees, administrative fees, inspection charges, and something called neighborhood restoration costs. Though nothing in the neighborhood had been damaged except Vivian's pride, Rebecca placed the legal notice into the binder, closed the cover, and looked at me across the kitchen table. "You know what bothers me most?" she asked. "The amount? The confidence. She has done this before, and she has won before." Rebecca was right, and that was exactly what the records were beginning to show. I asked the Garrison Housing Office to identify every active duty family in Cedar Ridge Heights that had reported an HOA dispute over the previous 7 years. The director, a retired warrant officer named Nina Brooks, had spent 19 years helping military families survive landlords, deployments, broken leases, mold, scams, and every other civilian problem that somehow became more complicated when one spouse was overseas. Nina did not ask why I needed the information. She only said, "How far back do you want me to dig? Until the pattern stops. That may take a while." "Sir, it took 9 days." The folders arrived in 2 locked cases and told a story Vivian would never have admitted out loud. 294 fines against military households, most involving parking, exterior appearance, yard maintenance, or noise. More than $300,000 collected, with the highest penalties falling on families during deployments, emergency transfers, and temporary duty assignments. One infantry sergeant had been fined daily because his grass grew too high while he was hospitalized after a training accident. A young Air Force couple paid nearly $6,000 after Vivian claimed their moving truck damaged a common curb, even though county photographs showed the crack had existed for 4 years. A Marine widow had received violation notices during the month after her husband died overseas because the memorial ribbons tied to her porch railing were not an approved color. I read that one twice. Then I closed the folder and stared through my office window at soldiers crossing the parade field in morning formation. I had commanded people under fire. I had written letters to parents whose sons did not come home. I knew what real danger looked like, and maybe that was why Vivian's behavior made me so angry. She had found people carrying enough weight already, then added more because she knew they were disciplined enough to endure it quietly. The legal team began interviewing residents, and the stories came out slowly at first. Then, all at once, families had been threatened with liens, towing, collections, and reports to military supervisors. Vivian routinely copied unit leadership on violation notices, making private disputes look like misconduct. She used official-sounding phrases like command notification pending and military compliance review, even though she had no authority to conduct either one. Her power came from suggestion. Young soldiers saw those words, imagined a first sergeant calling them into an office, and paid. When Major Donovan showed me the spreadsheet, she pointed to a column of dates. "Sir, look at when the penalties increase." Nearly every sharp increase happened within days of a deployment roster becoming known. Somehow Vivian knew which residents were leaving, when they were leaving, and which spouses would remain behind. That information was not classified, but it was not supposed to be circulating through an HOA office either. I asked one question: who has access? The answer led us to Vivian's husband, Daniel Crow, a civilian program manager in Fort Redstone's facilities division. Daniel supervised maintenance scheduling for several buildings and had access to internal housing coordination lists used to prevent service interruptions during deployments. He was not supposed to share those lists. He'd also spent 13 years awarding small landscaping and snow removal contracts, the kind that rarely attract attention because each one sits below the threshold that triggers a larger review. I asked the contracting office for 6 years of Daniel's awards. What came back changed the entire case. More than $2 million in groundskeeping contracts had gone to a company called Summit Crest Property Solutions. The company had no equipment, no permanent employees, and no physical office beyond a mailbox at a shipping store. It won contracts without competition, then subcontracted the actual work to local companies for far less than the government paid. The difference moved through 2 consulting accounts and eventually into a neighborhood improvement fund controlled by Vivian Crow. Daniel approved the federal contracts. Vivian controlled the company receiving the profit. The HOA fund paid for clubhouse renovations, board retreats, legal bills, luxury holiday parties, and a leased SUV listed as a community inspection vehicle. I remember sitting in a secure conference room at 5:40 in the morning, looking at a flow chart spread across the table, while an audit specialist traced the money with the tip of a pencil. "Colonel," he said, "your HOA president is not merely difficult." I had reached that conclusion. He almost smiled. Her husband appears to have diverted approximately $2.4 million in federal funds through a shell vendor. Some of that money then financed HOA enforcement against military families whose deployment information he obtained through his government position. For a moment, the room went completely quiet. There are discoveries that feel satisfying, and there are discoveries that make your stomach turn because they confirm the problem is worse than you hoped. This was the second kind. I called Army criminal investigators, the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, and an assistant United States attorney named Evelyn Shaw. Within 48 hours, the records were copied, sealed, and transferred into federal evidence. Search warrants were drafted. Financial accounts were frozen quietly. A grand jury began hearing testimony. Only 6 people knew the full scope of the investigation, and Rebecca was not one of them. That was the hardest part. She knew I was working late. New agents were visiting headquarters. Knew the binder had been replaced by locked evidence cases, but I could not tell her why. One night, she found me sitting alone on the back deck after midnight, scout asleep against my boots, the mountains black against the sky full of stars. She sat beside me and said, "Are we safe?" "Yes." "Is Owen safe?" "Yes." She watched me for a while. "Then I can wait." That was our marriage in 4 words. She did not demand what I could not give. She simply stayed beside me until the porch light filled with moths and the night air turned cold. Vivian, meanwhile, mistook my silence for surrender. She organized an emergency HOA meeting and displayed enlarged photographs of Owen's truck as if she were presenting evidence for a murder scene. She proposed a $5,000 special penalty and authorized towing from our driveway. The motion passed 6-3. I attended in jeans and a plain blue shirt, sat in the back row, and said nothing until the end. Then I stood and told the board that every document, vote, threat, and payment demand would be reviewed by federal counsel. Vivian leaned into the microphone and smiled. "Federal counsel does not govern Cedar Ridge Heights." "Colonel." "No," I said, "but federal law governs your husband." Her smile flickered. "Just once." And that tiny movement told me she knew there was something to find. After that, her harassment turned personal. Someone dragged a key along Rebecca's SUV from the front door to the rear wheel. Our porch camera caught Vivian approaching the vehicle in the same pale blue blazer she had worn on my driveway, glancing toward the street and lowering one hand out of frame. 2 mornings later, a tow truck arrived before sunrise and began hooking Owen's Silverado from private property. Owen ran outside barefoot while I followed with my phone recording. The driver examined the work order, looked at our deed markers, and immediately lowered the truck. "I was told this was abandoned on HOA common space," he said. "Who told you that?" I asked. He tapped the name at the bottom of the order. Vivian Crow. Owen stood beside his truck after the driver left, one hand resting on the faded paint above the wheel. "Dad, why does she care this much?" That question stayed with me because it was the question everyone asks when confronted by obsession. The answer is usually not the fence, the truck, the grass, or the color of a wreath. People like Vivian care because obedience proves they matter. Every fine paid was a salute she had not earned. Every frightened family was evidence that her clipboard could move people. I put my hand on Owen's shoulder and told him, "She cares because nobody stopped her early." He looked toward Vivian's house at the end of the ridge. "Are you going to stop her?" "No," I said. "She is going to stop herself." She nearly did it 3 days later when she sent a 16-page complaint to my commanding general, complete with photographs, witness statements, and a petition containing 37 signatures. Several signatures belonged to residents who later said they had never seen the document. 2 belonged to people who had moved out the previous year. 1 belonged to a man who had been dead for 6 months. My general called me and asked whether he should be concerned. I told him to keep the Saturday before Independence Day open and bring his dress uniform. "That sounds expensive," he said. "Not for us, sir." Vivian's final move arrived Friday afternoon in the form of a press release. She announced a public news conference at the Cedar Ridge Clubhouse, where she promised to expose corruption, intimidation, and misconduct by Fort Redstone's garrison commander. She invited local television stations, newspapers, neighborhood bloggers, veterans groups, In every homeowner within 5 miles, she prepared a podium, banners, enlarged photographs, and a statement demanding my removal from command. Rebecca read the release over my shoulder at the kitchen table, set down her coffee, and said, "Marcus, she invited cameras. She did, to a federal arrest." I looked at the time printed beneath the announcement, then picked up my phone and called Evelyn Shaw. By sunset, Army investigators, federal agents, county deputies, military police, and my commanding general were synchronized to the minute. Vivian wanted an audience. For the first time in this entire mess, I decided it would be rude not to give her one. Saturday morning came bright and dry, the kind of Colorado morning that made the mountains look close enough to touch. By 8 o'clock, the Cedar Ridge Clubhouse parking lot was already crowded. Vivian had built herself a stage beneath the front portico, complete with a podium, 2 American flags, a banner that read "Community Standards Matter," and 3 oversized photographs of Owen's Silverado with red circles around the faded paint. Local news crews parked along the curb. Residents filled folding chairs, and Vivian's board members sat behind her in matching white polo shirts, as if they were about to announce a charity golf tournament instead of publicly destroying a family. Vivian arrived at 8:20 in a navy blazer, pearl earrings, and a smile so polished it could have reflected sunlight. Daniel stood in the second row holding coffee, looking mildly annoyed by the whole production, like a man forced to attend his wife's hobby. At 8:28, Rebecca and I turned into the parking lot. I was wearing dress blues. Beside me walked Major Donovan in her JAG uniform, 2 Army criminal investigators in dark suits, 3 federal agents, Assisting United States Attorney Evelyn Shaw, and the Major General who commanded the region. Behind us came a county sheriff's cruiser and a federal marshal's vehicle. The camera swung in our direction before Vivian even realized what was happening. I watched her smile hold for 1 second too long, then collapse at the corners. We crossed the asphalt without hurrying. That mattered to me. People expect anger to move fast. Real authority rarely has to. Vivian gripped the podium and said into the microphone, "This is a private association event." Evelyn Shaw answered before I could. "Not anymore." The crowd went silent. I stopped 10 feet from the stage, removed my cap, and looked directly at Vivian. "You invited the press to discuss my conduct," I said. "I thought it was only fair that we discuss yours." Someone in the crowd laughed, then immediately tried to hide it with a cough. Vivian lifted her chin. "Colonel, this is exactly the intimidation I warned everyone about." "No," I said. "This is accountability. You have simply never seen it from this side." Evelyn stepped forward, opened a leather folder, and began reading. Daniel Crow was charged with wire fraud, mail fraud, theft of government property, honest services fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and unlawful use of protected government information. The federal marshal moved toward him as Evelyn spoke. Daniel's coffee cup slipped from his hand and hit the pavement, splashing across his shoes. He looked at Vivian first, not the marshal, and the expression on his face told me something their marriage probably had not admitted in years. He blamed her for making it visible. Vivian pushed away from the podium. "Daniel, tell them this is a mistake." Daniel said nothing. The marshal turned him around, cuffed his wrists, and read him his rights while every camera Vivian had invited captured the moment. Then Evelyn looked at Vivian. "Mrs. Crow, federal agents are executing search warrants at your residence, the HOA office, and 3 financial institutions. You are not being taken into custody at this time, but you are a named subject of the continuing investigation." Vivian's face went pale, though she still tried to hold herself upright. "This is retaliation," she said. "He did this because of a truck." Rebecca was standing behind me, and I heard her whisper, "She still thinks this is about the truck." Major Donovan placed a thick civil complaint on the podium. The Army Legal Assistance Office, joined by 21 military families, was filing suit against Cedar Ridge Heights for unlawful fines, fraudulent collection practices, harassment, retaliation, and misuse of deployment information. The amount collected for military households was just over $300,000, not including interest or damages. Vivian stared at the complaint as though the pages had appeared by magic. I leaned toward the microphone and said, "For 7 years, you chose families who were young, deployed, grieving, or afraid. You counted on their silence. You called military police to enforce private rules, copied commanders on false notices, and used information obtained through your husband's federal position to identify the people least able to fight back. You thought military discipline meant weakness. What it actually meant was that they kept records. Vivian looked past me toward the residence, searching for support. None came. One board member quietly removed his white polo shirt and folded it over his lap. Another stood and walked away from the chairs. The retired sergeant whose wife had paid $4,000 during his deployment raised his voice from the back. "You knew I was overseas." Vivian turned toward him. "I enforced the bylaws equally. You raised the fines 3 days after I left." Another voice followed, then another. A widow asked about the violation notices she received while planning her husband's funeral. A young couple asked why their payment had gone into a clubhouse fund that financed Vivian's leased Mercedes. The crowd that had once been afraid of her began speaking all at once, and for the first time since I had met her. Vivian had no clipboard large enough to control the room. The Major General stepped to the microphone last and announced that Fort Redstone was terminating its informal dispatch arrangement with the HOA. Military police would respond to genuine emergencies, but they would no longer answer property complaints, parking disputes, or aesthetic enforcement requests from Cedar Ridge. Sergeant Mendoza stood beside the patrol vehicle and watched Vivian hear that decision. She had spent years treating his soldiers like personal security guards. Now the radio had gone silent for her. Daniel pleaded guilty 5 months later. He received 46 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release, permanent disqualification from federal contracting, and restitution exceeding $2 million. Vivian avoided prison but lost nearly everything else. The civil settlement required repayment of every unlawful fine with interest, surrender of the HOA-controlled accounts, and a permanent prohibition against serving on any homeowners association board. She sold the house the following spring and left before sunrise without saying goodbye to anyone. The old board dissolved itself before residents could remove it. Rebecca was elected temporary chair on the condition that the bylaws be rewritten in plain English and reduced from 98 pages to 14. Her first rule was simple. No board member could enter private property, contact an employer, or order a tow without legal review and a recorded vote. Her second rule was that meetings had to end by 7:30 because, as she put it, no neighborhood decision improves after people miss dinner. Owen restored the Silverado that summer. He fixed the faded paint, not because Vivian had demanded it, but because he wanted to. At the first community cookout under the new board, he parked it outside the clubhouse with a cardboard sign in the windshield that read, "Not a military vehicle. No enforcement required." Even Sergeant Mendoza laughed at that one. The settlement money returned more than $300,000 to military families, including a widow who had nearly lost her home while her husband was deployed. Rebecca and I helped create a legal support fund for service members facing HOA abuse, and within 2 years it had taken cases in 11 states. I stayed at Fort Redstone until retirement, and we never left Cedar Ridge. The neighborhood sounds different now. Kids play basketball after 7. Garage doors stay open while neighbors talk. Somebody grills on Wednesdays without triggering a tactical response. Sometimes I still think about Vivian standing behind that podium, surrounded by cameras she invited, insisting the entire federal case was about one faded truck. Maybe that was how she survived herself. By believing the consequences came from one angry colonel instead of hundreds of quiet choices she made when she thought nobody important was watching. So tell me what you think. Did I wait too long and let too many families get hurt? Or is patience the only way to expose everything behind her power? Drop your answer in the comments. Share your own HOA story. And subscribe if you believe the loudest person in the neighborhood is not always the one holding the real authority.